Hello and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on a very esteemed topic, which everybody seems to be talking about it these days, the investigation of the flow of arms and military aid from the US and the United Kingdom to Israel. My name is Rasha Qandil and I will be your moderator today. I am the current editor-in-chief and the co-founder of Times for Palestine electronic website newspaper. And I used to be a lead presenter at BBC Arabic TV for a long time, like 20-something years. Today, we are addressing the topic or the main focus of the whole world, not only the Middle East, the topic of global significance, the flow of arms and military aid from the US and the UK to Israel. In recent years, both countries have supplied significant amounts of military hardware and financial aid to Israel, often raising critical questions about the legality, the ethics, and human rights implications of these transfers, particularly in the context of ongoing war in Palestine and recently in Lebanon in the last 48 hours or so. This session will delve into how investigative journalists can expose the trail of arms, scrutinize the defense contracts, and report on the political and economic interests that drive these deals. Our speakers today will provide insights on how to track these military aid packages, investigate the companies involved, and explore the human impact of these weapons transfers on the ground in Israel and Palestine. This will also discuss the implications of these arms on international law, accountability, and efforts to ensure transparency. I'm really eager to introduce my colleagues. I'm delighted to introduce each one of them, our esteemed speakers for today. First, Ari Tolany is an investigative journalist specializing in arms trade. And I really have a pack of questions to Ari today. She's currently a senior reporter where she covers defense contracts and military supply chains between Western countries and the conflict zones, specifically the Middle East that we're talking about today. We also would like to introduce John Chapelle. He is a geopolitical analyst and author of several reports on military aid and arms exports from the US and the UK. And today would be really grateful if we focus on the region, on the Middle East today. His most recent work focuses on the political motivations behind military aid to Israel and the broader implications for regional stability, which is something that journalists usually forget to report on when they are in the esteemed everyday coverage of the region. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Mr. Iain Overton. He is the executive director of the London-based charity Action of Arms Violence and the author of one of my favorite books, actually, The Price of Paradise, How the Arms Trade is Fueling the Global Conflict. So from a different, probably international law and international relations perspective, his research has been at the forefront of examining the human cost of arms proliferation and the responsibility of Western powers in global conflicts. Welcome to everybody today, and I'm really thanking our speakers for giving us this precious time to discuss the current situation. For those who are not familiar with the GIJN, before we dive in, this is the Global Investigative Journalism Network, GIJN, which is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations with 244 member organizations in over 90 countries, which is a smashing coverage of the globe, probably. We work with journalists everywhere in nonprofits, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. I'm only representing the GIJN for today, giving me the honor to introduce each one of you and to interview later on. So let's start with Ari Tolany. Ari, I've been following your work when I was a senior fellow of the Center for International Policy, and it's really interesting of how you track and build up your hypothesis when it comes to the arms trade, specifically in the Biden administration. So how would you advise journalists to follow on these policies, specifically in these complicated background of the Middle East?
Certainly. So I'll just quickly reintroduce myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Ari Tolany. I'm the director of the Security Assistance Monitor, where, as our moderator said, I track and monitor global arms flows. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and so I focus on the export just of the United States to other countries. And as we get started, I want to give a little bit of context and perspective for why this matters. All of us watching the news in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Sudan are able to see the brutal impacts of the arms trade, and particularly the US arms trade. But sometimes I think it can be difficult to capture the scale of this tragedy. And so I want to really highlight why I think that this work is so important and why United States arms sales are the connective tissue between all forms of civilian harm, many forms of civilian harm and damage abroad, as well as violations of international law. So from the year 2019 to the year 2024, the United States sold arms to 107 different countries. So that is most of the states, that is 42% of the global market. We sell 200% more weapons than our next competitor, France. And critically, many of the United States' key security partners and recipients, whether Israel, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or others, are those that are engaged in active armed conflict and have been credibly and repeatedly accused of severe violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. So that's sort of my pitch for why it's so important to track this. I'm going to now give us a few resources that I find helpful in really pulling concrete data to understand what is being appropriated and sent to other countries, as well as just break down a few basic terms that can be quite confusing and are often reported on in a way that is contradictory, because these, and let's be clear, this is deliberately confusing, right? It is in the interests of United States government and commercial interests to make this hard to track. So we're going to try and break this down. But I recognize that this is a complex topic and there's going to be some different aspects of this that may be unfamiliar to different viewers. So please, if there's anything confusing, I'm happy to address it in questions or take an email afterwards, whatever is most convenient. So I'm going to start by showing what I think is some of the best resources, and I'm biased because this is the resource that we run, but this is the Security Assistance Monitor at International Policy. And so the Center for International Policy. So you can see here that you can break down arms sales and security assistance by different countries. So you can click on Israel and get a historical record of the aid that the United States has provided to Israel, or you can break it down by the type of aid. So there are three main types of aid that we report on. I'll note that we are hoping to expand this, but require more staff and funding to do so. But this is a work in progress, and I'm hoping that the database will grow larger and have more longitudinal data for journalists and others to use. So you'll note that in that website, there are three separate data sources. There are arms sales, so things that the United States sells to other countries, security sector assistance, so the ways that the United States works by, with, and through other states, and foreign military training, so the different ways that the United States trains foreign militaries and police institutions. And I want us to really focus in on the arms sales piece of this, because I think this is the part where we have the most opportunity for transparency and accountability. So I'm going to break down a few terms that I think are important to understand the arms trade. The first is foreign military sales, which in English and popular media is often abbreviated as FMS. And so a foreign military sale is when another state purchases a defense article or service from the United States, and the United States government is actually the middleman or the broker for that transaction. This is opposed to direct commercial sales, which is when a foreign actor purchases directly from a United States company. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because we have a lot more transparency in foreign military sales because of the governmental role than we do in direct commercial sales. So there is a lot that is not perfect about the United States arms trade and public reporting. However, one of the strongest benefits that we do have is the requirement for congressional notification and public notification for arms sales that are over a particular dollar threshold or cost a certain amount. So for NATO plus states, including Israel, South Korea, as well as members of NATO, that cost is $100 million for defense articles and services. So if a case costs more than $100 million, it is required to be publicly notified. And so this is one of the most useful places that you can find this out, is going to this website, which will have all of the publicly notified arms sales that are over this dollar threshold to a given country in a year. So this is one of the key sites that we use in pulling our data to put together more comprehensive reports. And so this is kind of your first line of defense when you're trying to figure out a sale, particularly a sale of a large volume. The other thing that I will flag is, so we have these two terms, FMS, foreign military sales, and DCS, direct commercial sales. There's one more acronym I want to throw at you, which is foreign military financing. And this is particularly important for cases of countries like Israel. So foreign military financing is when the United States government uses its own money that the American taxpayers provide to allow other countries to purchase US-made weapons. So for cases like Israel, for cases like Egypt, huge amounts of funding are tied to foreign military financing, which is to say that the United States taxpayer provides it. And so when you look at some of these cases that are put up on that Defense Security Cooperation website, you can also see how it's paid for. And that gets us into some more of the sort of tricky and interesting parts of this. So that's how you find out about basic information about cost, sales over a particular threshold. There are some other pathways that can be used that are a little more complex. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. But I will not go into the direct commercial sale process right now because it's highly technical. But of course, if there's anything I can do to be useful on that, please let me know. The other thing that I want to highlight is one of the other best places that you can be looking to find out information about arms sales and funding is going to our congressional website, congress.gov, which posts updates on the different financial bills. So for example, we are in the 118th Congress right now. This was the bill that was passed in April that allocated billions of dollars in foreign military financing billions of dollars in foreign military financing to Israel. And so by going through these different bills, you can break down what money is being provided in the form of grants and assistance, and what is being provided in the form of direct sales that other countries are purchasing. So basically the question that you are thinking about is, who's funding this? Is it the United States or is it another country who's paying for it? And then that helps us break into the data that we need to most accurately assess it. I think that is most of what I wanted to share. So I really want to highlight the Security Assistance Monitor, which tracks all of this information longitudinally. We have information going back from the late 90s to the present day. I will note that our website is still under development and is a little bit glitchy. So if you're having any problems or issues with data pulls, please feel free to just get in contact with me and I can help you or your journalistic outlet find the information you need. I also want to re-up the Defense Cooperation, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA.mil, which I will share that link again in one moment, where you can go and you can see major notifications of foreign military sales that are over a certain dollar threshold. And then also making sure that you are signed up for updates on congress.gov, particularly for supplementals and appropriations, because this will break down essentially what money the United States government is allocating for different countries, programs, and regions. And this is the best way to get an idea of the amount of money that is being handled and given to Israel. One other thing that I will notice before I turn it over to my fellow panelist, John, is the issue that we have, and this is my biggest problem in running the Security Assistance Monitor, is the difference between when a sale is approved and when a sale is delivered. So when you look at this notification website, you'll see, for example, that the United States government approved the transfer of $4 billion worth of drones and surveillance equipment to the government of India. However, because this is a big, complex package that involves a lot of high-tech stuff, this can take years to deliver. So it can be really hard to find out essentially the difference between what is the amount of money that was authorized to be given to a particular partner and when did these actual munitions go out the door. So for example, for a $4 billion deal, that could be authorized in 2024, but you could have 2 billion sent out in 2026 and another 2 billion sent out in 2028, making it very difficult to have a complete and holistic longitudinal picture of security assistance and cooperation. And so that's one of the things that I know that it makes it most difficult to pull data. And so when you are looking at data, it's very good to be clear if you are looking at the amount authorized or appropriated, which is to say the amount that was initially approved, or the amount that was delivered, which is to say the amount that left a United States port and went to an end user, whether it be Israel, India, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I see that there are lots of questions. I will re-up all of those links, but I don't want to exceed my time, so I will turn it back to our esteemed moderator.
Thank you very much, Ari. I would really like to invite everybody to send us questions at the box of Q&A, and we'll handle the questions at the very end of the presentations of colleagues. Moving from Ari to John, I would like to discuss with you, there was a joint paper of you and Ari together, and I think most of the journalists from the region today would like to know more about how you get your sources and how do you build your hypothesis as well.
Sure. Thank you, Rasha, and thanks to GIJN for hosting. Thanks to our excellent interpreters as well. I'll do a quick reintroduction and then I'll address that question along with some other issues. So I'm John Ramming Chapelle. I'm primarily a lawyer. I focus on U.S. arms transfers and security assistance, both U.S. law and policy and international law. And I work at Center for Civilians in Conflict and used to work, still work very closely. We used to work in the same organization as Ari. And as I'm talking a bit, I'm going to talk about international law and U.S. law and policy and how they fit into arms sales. And as I do that, I'll talk also, Rasha, about how to look into this and what sources to turn to. And the goal here is really not for you to all become experts. It's not for you to become lawyers. People go to law school for a long time to do that, but rather to get you familiar with some of the legal and policy frameworks that can help guide your journalism. And so that you can see what the implications for law and policy can be from the facts that you're looking into. And this isn't legal advice, and I do recommend that when it comes to the application of the law to specific facts, you check in with an attorney who's specialized in these areas. So hopefully this can give you a bit of a map about what to ask for. First, I'm going to mention very quickly that when it comes to a lot of the issues that arise in the context of arms transfers, we're talking about international humanitarian law and international human rights law. International humanitarian law, just very quickly understood as a body of law that applies to the conduct of hostilities in the context of armed conflict. And international human rights law essentially governs everything else. And these overlap and they interact, but that's a useful place to start. And one thing that I think is helpful also as we're talking about international law is to flag that certain words that we use sometimes colloquially in an everyday way also can have legal meaning. And so that means they're defined either in statutes or in treaties or in sources of customary international law. And some of those are things like war crime, crime against humanity, atrocity crime, also the word civilian, the words like indiscriminate or disproportionate. And so these are words that you should absolutely know and use in your reporting, but you should also sometimes consult with legal experts to see if it is indeed the appropriate word for the situation that you're dealing with. And so also, when you have violations of international humanitarian law or international human rights law, there are implications for arms transfers. And those implications are laid out in various sources of international law. One of those is Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions. This is a part of the Geneva Conventions that commits all states to ensure respect for the conventions. And that's also, according to the International Committee on the Red Cross, that obligation to ensure respect extends to all states, regardless of whether they're a party to a conflict. And it essentially stipulates that states have to use their influence to the extent possible to stop violations of international humanitarian law. And of course, states that are providing weapons to another state that is violating international humanitarian law has a particular degree of influence that they are under an obligation to use in this interpretation laid out by the International Committee on the Red Cross. The United States, however, it's worth noting, disagrees with that interpretation. States can also be responsible for the violations of international law of others, including by transferring weapons. And so the source here is the draft articles of state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts. And Article 16, if I remember correctly, says that a state that aids or assists in another state in the commission of an internationally wrongful act is internationally responsible for that act. They're complicit if they do so with the knowledge of the circumstances of the act, and the act would be internationally wrongful if it were committed by that state. Now, not only can states be responsible, but so can individuals. And individual liability is more the realm of, for example, the International Criminal Court or the ad hoc tribunals governing international criminal law. And this is distinct from state responsibility that I just mentioned, and it mostly comes from the case law of those tribunals. But individuals, such as foreign ministry officials, State Department officials, employees at arms manufacturers, can be held liable for atrocity crimes if they substantially and knowingly contribute to the commission of that crime. And that can include approving arms transfers. There's also treaty law that deals with arms transfers. The Arms Trade Treaty is for the best known. It has 115 state parties, and it obliges states to assess both human rights and international humanitarian law risks in arms exports. And it also prohibits the transfer of arms if a state has knowledge at the time of the authorization that the arms would be used in atrocity crimes. Even if there's not a prohibition under that article, states also have to not send arms if there's, quote, an overriding risk that arms could be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international human rights law or international humanitarian law. Similarly, the European Union has a legal framework that I won't get into here in the common position that is legally binding for member states and also deals with a prohibition on arms transfers when there's a clear risk that they would be used in serious violations of international humanitarian law. That's finally, on the international law side, the International Court of Justice, I'm sure many of you saw, probably everyone here saw, released an advisory opinion that deals with the lawfulness of Israel's apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory. And as a result of the unlawfulness of occupation, there are obligations that third states have to adhere to. And that includes an obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. And that's a quote from the opinion. Arms transfers are a particularly crucial form of assistance. And so this has implications, certainly, for the legality of arms transfers. That's international law. Now I'll very quickly talk a bit about the United States. So the US has its own legal framework, some of which reference international law and some that don't, about the permissibility of arms transfers. And the reason I want to talk about all of this is so that you can, again, know what direction to point in and know what information to look for and what questions to ask as you're doing investigative reporting from a legal perspective. And so these are all frameworks that deal with the permissibility of arms transfers from the United States. So it's a question of, are US arms exports legal as a matter of US law? One law that you might have heard of is the Leahy Law. And the Leahy Law, that's L-E-A-H-Y in English, prohibits military aid to units of foreign military or foreign security forces where there's credible information they've committed a gross violation of international law, international human rights. And so that is a unit by unit restriction. And so it means that if the State Department determines there is credible information with respect to a specific unit, that unit is barred from receiving US assistance until such time the perpetrators of the violation are brought to justice. Section 620I applies at a very different scale. So Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which bans military aid to countries to governments rather, that restrict or prohibit the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. This has been especially relevant and contentious in the context of Gaza, and many of you might have seen that recently ProPublica reported that internally the State Department just a few months ago had determined that Section 620I was triggered, but reportedly Secretary Antony Blinken overrode that determination. Operating similarly at the country level, Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which prohibits arms sales or military aid to any country where the government engages in, quote, a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. And so this is the same standard, gross violation of human rights, as the Leahy Law. That's a defined term, but operating at the country level and on the standard of consistent information instead of at the unit level. Then there's the Arms Export Control Act. This is a law that lists the approved purposes for U.S. arms sales. And one of the listed purposes, and the one that is the most relevant in the context of arms transfers to Israel, is legitimate self-defense. And so many times there have been lively debates, including in 1982, over whether the government of Israel has used U.S. weapons in a manner that is consistent with those narrow purposes, including legitimate self-defense. I'll close out with a couple of policies. One is the conventional arms transfer policy, and the operative part of this policy stipulates that the U.S. won't transfer weapons when it is more likely than not that they'll be used to facilitate, sorry, I have a ringer going. I'm just going to turn it off. There we go. Okay. Done. To facilitate, commit, or to facilitate or commit the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law or international human rights law. This is Biden's own policy. It was released just in the last couple of years. This is one of the policies that appears to be regularly violated in the context of the Biden administration's arms transfers. There's also National Security Memorandum 20, which requires that to be eligible to receive US-funded US weapons, governments have to provide assurances that they will not block humanitarian aid and that they will abide by relevant international law. Finally, I want to talk about the US Congress. Congress has a lot of responsibility when it comes to arms sales in the United States. They have a great deal of constitutional oversight. And so there are different mechanisms where the Congress can force votes on the floor in our legislature to require a public debate on different aspects of arms sales. One of those mechanisms is available in Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, and that has been put to a vote once in January by Senator Sanders. And then the Arms Export Control Act is the other tool, and Senator Sanders, Senator Merkley, and Senator Welch have just introduced 6 joint resolutions of disapproval under the Arms Export Control Act, and we're expecting votes on those to block individual arms sales potentially in November. That's all that I've got for now. That's a very dense presentation. I'm very glad to dig into anything else. Thank you, Rasha, and thank you to our guests.
Thank you very, very much, John. And we are looking forward to receive your tools and your sources on the chat box as well, or afterwards on email. I would like to move smoothly from the US front to the UK front and start Iain's presentation. We would like to know from you, Iain, firstly, about the accountability of the UK arms transfers to Israel and how you work on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I've kind of prepared a slightly different presentation, but I will be addressing that
absolutely fine. Thank you.
further down the line. Salam alaikum to everyone joining. So yeah, I run Action on Armed Violence, which is a UK-based charity. Can everyone see my slides? Yeah. Can you see them?
Yes,
Yep.
please go ahead.
Good.
Yeah.
So Action on Violence, we basically investigate everything from direct civilian harm to war crimes to the transfer of weapons to countries that are involved in crimes. And I just wanted to sort of touch on 3 case studies to give an idea of how I translate, a thesis or an idea or a concern into a news story. I give you an example of sort of looking at the US perspective. I was really interested in having traveled extensively around places like Iraq and Syria and witnessing a lot of American weapons in the hands of Salafist jihadists. I was kind of interested how they ended up in such hands. And so I kind of asked the fundamental question, how many guns did the US government hand over to Iraq and Afghanistan? And I found out that the Pentagon provided 1.45 million firearms to security forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, of which around 700,000 they lost. So you take a premise and you kind of subvert it by asking, I've seen a proliferation on the ground. Then I want to take it back and I find out the data. So how did I get the data? Well, I asked for freedom of information requests from the US Department of Defense. I was like, how many did you give to this country? How many did you give to this country? How much did you spend? And then I cross-reference what they said in the FOI responses to what I found on the US Department of Defense systems, as well as the federal procurement database systems. And we found that the US Department of Defense had established contracts of over 40 billion in small arms, including ammunition and attachments. So it's not just the gun itself. You often get hand stocks, you often get magazines, you get the munitions itself. But there are upper and lower limits, and you can analyze those. And ultimately, you could then, through systems of analyzing where the end user was given, how many were used by the US military themselves, and how many were then handed over to security forces overseas. But the daily Department of Defense contract publications only touched a very upper limit. So only 3% were really published at the time. Ari mentioned before that there's an they only publish above a certain spend. And so one of the ways that subterfuge occurs, I think, and I say subterfuge with precision because I got insiders telling me that the US Department of Defense purposefully sold AK-47s or bought AK-47s under the publishable limit that they could then proliferate within groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, so that when an AK-47 was seen on the evening news in the hands of a rebel group, nobody would immediately say that's American bought. If it was an M16, people would have said it was an American bought. So we were looking out for AK-47s, we were looking out for lower level contracts, and under right to reply, the Department of Defense admitted 700,000 small arms were sent to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we began to look into that. We also found quite sizable differences between the US Department of Defense and the federal procurement database system contract listings. And in that gap, you can sometimes find quite juicy stories. So we did stories on transparency issues, omitting key details such as foreign military sales. We showed that there were errors in contract numbers, missing awards, and overspend that wasn't visible. We delved deep into the federal procurement data system, which is pretty robust in revealing a lot, which the Department of Defense isn't. And so it's kind of a backdoor into the data. And obviously, by taking unique contract numbers, which are called procurement instrument identifiers, we could then trace whether this was reported by the DoD or elsewhere. And we found 33% of DoD contracts were misnumbered. We found that 10 companies won the vast majority of these contracts, but deep within the data, we found investigative gems like a Jordanian tractor company getting over £1 million plus to buy AK-47s and ship them in to Syria. So therein lies some of the really interesting work you can find. And we ended up working with the New York Times and How Many Guns Did the US Lose? And we worked with CJ Chivers, who's a brilliant journalist for the NYT. The second case study is the big question, Britain's second biggest arms export, Britain's the second biggest arms exporter in the world, according to our own government. Our largest arms exporter is BAE Systems. And the interesting question that no journalist had ever asked is, how many countries does BAE Systems sell to? Well, we found that they definitely had sold in the last decade to 81 countries, reported sales to 12 more. 48% of UN member states have received BAE's arms, so not direct sales, but also indirect sales. And we were really interested in the journalistic story is what countries had poor human rights record. So we did cross comparisons, identifying which countries BAE Systems sold to. We cross compared it to things like Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. And we found that 55% of BAE clients scored low on that. We looked at how many incidents of explosive weapons harming civilians were in BAE armed countries. How did we get this sort of data? Well, we went into BAE Systems annual reports and we looked at where the countries they had listed in those. We looked at media reports, credible second source reports out in the public domain saying BAE Systems had won this contract. We looked at governmental press releases. So a lot of times you got like the Sierra Leonean government issuing a press release. They had just bought this system from BAE. And also we cross-referenced to other NGOs as well as identifying what weapons may have been used in a conflict and then reporting back referencing using systems like GIJNs, trying to work out what weapons they were and if they would be manufactured by BAE. And so this cross-referencing enabled us to find corruption patterns of BAE clients, enabled us to do an analysis, for instance, of the British government has a list of human rights concerned countries and we found that BAE Systems had sold to 10 of those on the human rights, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq. We found, incidentally, that Israel isn't even on the FCDO's human rights priority list. And we found that there were significant concerns of selling countries where there was raised questions of international humanitarian law violations, as well as controversial countries such as Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan flagged for severe human rights abuses by international watchdogs. We also looked at other things. So what countries have experienced coups in the recent years? And we cross-referenced how many of those have been armed by BAE. So ultimately, we came out with stories, CNBC picked it up, defense giant system linked to arms deals and countries accused of human rights reports. And that's how we managed to get our stories out. And then the third issue, which is reverting back to what I should have been speaking about for the last 10 minutes, which is who's arming Israel. So we did a deep dive into finding out who's arming Israel, a combination of national reporting, media reporting, and NGO reporting, 23 billion in military aid since October. This is a few months ago we did this, but we found that UK firms continuing to supply component parts, and even though they've suspended 30 of 300 armed licenses, 270 are still in operation. We also examined the complex multinational arms sale contract deliverables. So if the UK says we will not export to Israel, that might feed into a wider cross-national deal that Israel has signed with, let's say, BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin and Northrop. And that causes real complications in the deliverables of things like the F-35 jets. And so there's intense lobbying in the Houses of Parliament for the UK government not to suspend F-35 arms exports to Israel because it will have knock-on effects to the US deliverable of those F-35s. We analyzed how German exports saw a tenfold increase in 2023. And we also looked at countries that actually had emerged in terms of legal challenges, like the suspension of 35 related equipment from the Netherlands to Israel. Where do we get all this from? Well, partly it was from really good websites like CIPRI, arms transfer databases. I recommend you go to the website I've just thrown there. It gives you a really good idea of who suppliers are, what weapons have been exported, relationship between different suppliers and recipients over time, countries in conflict, states implementing export control regulations. But we also looked, obviously, from a UK perspective, what our own Committee on Arms Export Controls was doing in this area. And we found it was largely doing nothing. Although constant pressure from advocacy journalist groups like ourselves did lead to a suspension. So the other thing which we looked at is just how much profits. You're investigative journalists, who's making the money? So we looked at Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, massive amounts of money going in. We looked at what their share prices were before the 7th of October and what they were at the point of reporting, and we compared the difference in share price ownership. But more importantly, we also looked at what the CEOs were doing with their share prices. There has been a massive sale off of shares by leading defense manufacturers post October the 7th in the lineup, thinking, well, look, my share price has gone through the roof. I might as well sell. And in the case of BAE Systems, I might as well sell and buy myself a luxury apartment in the middle of London. And I won't, ignore the fact that there are dead babies that have been the price of that purchase. I mean, it's about really making the story relevant to the audience. Like, how many guns did America lose in Iraq and Afghanistan? 1.4 million. What profits did BAE Systems make out of selling to Israel? He bought this house. What sort of big journalistic storytelling can you ultimately conclude at the end of your investigation? That's me done. Thanks.
That's absolutely perfect. We have a very rich 3 presentations from all of you, and this gives us more time for questions, which is excellent. That never happens. So I would like to start with Ari again. And the question is from Mohammed. Mohammed is asking you, Ari, on what legal or commercial basis does the United States allow the exports of weapons to Israel more than other countries?
Sure. So there's kind of 2 answers to this. There is the technical answer, which is the ways that the United States provides waivers and uses all sorts of loopholes to avoid accountability for Israel. And I can talk about some of those mechanisms in more detail. However, the fundamental answer is the United States refuses to hold Israel to account. And so we can talk about the ways that the United States does that by using things like refusing to apply the Leahy law to Israel, by choosing not to implement the legal tools that it does have under the Foreign Assistance Act, like Section 620I, which bars US assistance from going to partners who are inhibiting humanitarian assistance. And I think it's very clear looking at Palestine and Lebanon that Israel is prohibiting humanitarian assistance. There's also Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. All of these are things that would seem to make arms sales to Israel illegal, particularly in light of the ongoing apartheid and genocide. However, the United States is often unwilling to hold its partners to account. The phrase that I use a lot is international law for thee and not for me. So the United States holds Israel to a different standard. There are all sorts of historical reasons of this dating back to before the Nakba that I know many people here will be familiar with. But the short answer is it should be illegal. The United States uses various waivers, loopholes, executive authorities, and powers to dodge the law so that it can continue to enforce the law for other states and not Israel. And I'll note that Israel is not the only country where we see these sort of violations of norms. The provision of billions of dollars of foreign military financing to Egypt, notwithstanding the continued disappearances and violations of international humanitarian law in the Sinai, the continuation of sales to Saudi Arabia, despite the horrible conditions in Yemen. There are many places where financial interests trump the law, and I think that this is the best example of that. Now, there are all sorts of waivers and ways the United States technically gets around that. And there's been really excellent English language reporting on how, for example, the Biden administration chose not to apply 620I, how the Biden administration chose not to apply the Leahy law. But the real thing I really want to emphasize here is under US law, transfers to Israel should be illegal. The United States uses all sorts of loopholes and double standards to prevent the transfer to facilitate the continued transfer of the weapons that are aiding and abetting severe violations of international law, including plausibly genocide.
This is an excellent, perfect question. Thank you so much, Ari, which moves me to John. And the question is from Tala. John. Tala's asking, what are your thoughts on the US government 8.7 billion sent to Israel for more war and attacks on innocent civilians?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So yes, a bit of context on this first. This is 8.3 billion as part of a package of supplemental funding that Congress passed earlier in the year. and that President Biden signed into law. And so Ari talked a little bit in her presentation about the difference between giving money and sending weapons that are bought with that money. And so this is a case where we're seeing money being sent that will then be used to buy weapons. And so those are two separate stages. And you know, I have to echo a lot of what we just heard from Ari, which is that U.S. arms transfers and military aid to Israel at this time are contrary to U.S. law and policy, contrary to international legal frameworks. And it's also bad politics, the bad international politics. The Biden administration claims that they are doing all that they can to secure a ceasefire in Gaza. And they send the exact opposite message with actions like this. The Biden administration absolutely cannot claim to be doing all they can to secure a ceasefire and protect civilians as long as they continue to nearly unconditionally arm the government of Israel. And so this move is highly disappointing. It's a shared responsibility between Congress and the executive branch in the United States, or the president. And the right thing for Congress to do in this situation would be to impose legal restrictions on continued arms exports to Israel.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, John. And this moves us to talking back again about the resources of arms transfer. And the question is to Iain from Clayton. Clayton is asking, what are the best methods of researching arms transfers, which are part of our bilateral or trilateral defense agreement in the US and the UK or the EUKS?
Yeah, you know, one of the curious realities of, I mean, maybe the US is that it's much more transparent than like China or Russia. So I kind of, you know, the UK government says it's the second biggest arms exporter in the world. The truth is, I think Russia and China are bigger, but they just don't declare it. So there's a huge amount of arms exports out there that we just never, ever get to hear about. And that's how North Korea gets its weapons, and Myanmar and all these other states, you know, and Iran, of course, is also an exporter. So, you know, we always have to take sort of published figures with a pinch of salt, both in terms of what they're saying and what they're not saying, as well as like it's proportional to other countries. When you come to multinational agreements and like ALSAC and others, obviously there will be some nations who are more transparent than others. So you know, the US actually, despite its massive military industrial complex, is very good at being honest about its massive military industrial complex. And you can get lots of data out there. The question is where do you exactly get that data from? And as I was saying before, it might have to be freedom of information requests. In the UK, you have to be a UK citizen, theoretically, to ask a FOI request. Remarkably, for the US, anyone in the world can ask the US an FOI request. And I've used lots of FOI requests to the US. The trouble is they can take months and months and months and are often rejected. Nonetheless, that is one way to find out. You can also do a cross comparison of what the US have declared, what the UK have declared, what Australia has declared, and see where the gaps might be, and ultimately do a jigsaw puzzling. So you're trying to find out, okay, this is reported here, this said that this was part of a deal, and yet the UK haven't reported on this. And then you have to go to the UK Ministry of Defence for a right to reply, or the UK Home Office for an arms export, right to reply, and you say, can you explain this and unpick this a little bit more for me? So it's often this is true investigative journalism, trying to unpick all this. And I would say you need a multinational approach. You need to be willing to submit freedom of information requests and willing to be able to say, as part of your wider reporting, that these are the gaps that we do not know. And that, you know, a lot of the work that I end up doing is not really end up finding X was done, but I go, this was missing, this was omitted, this is what we do not know. And at least you as journalists have got that kind of statement of fact that this is not on the public record, it should be, and then that equips you to ask those awkward questions to ministers when you next get them in front of a camera.
This is perfect. Thank you so much, Iain. And the resource that I hope that Iain or Majduline has shared with the group It's the website SIPRI, which is a database of arms sale and transfers. And as Iain just said, the missing parts are the important parts. So for example, on SIPRI, if you look at the sales of armament and then the arms that has been used, you can like calculate it and then know how much of the weapons actually bought this year have been used already, which gives you more question marks and more answers later on. There is a question from Majdoulin to Ari. Majdoulin is asking, what are the legal and commercial standards and frameworks that Congress follows to approve the reject or reject the weapons shipment, Ari?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it's one that's a little bit complicated. So there is a congressional notification threshold in the United States. That's how we pull a lot of this publicly available information about foreign military sales and direct commercial sales. However, we have seen that Congress repeatedly does not use necessarily the tools that are available to it. So part of the way that this works, and I'll share a resource in the chat after this, is before there is a formal congressional notification, the Department of State comes to the relevant congressional committees and tells them informally, here's what we expect to happen. And so that is often the place where Congress will exercise some degree of oversight. So for example, Chairman Gregory Meeks was not comfortable with the Nigerian Air Force's record on civilian harm when it came to the transfer of Bell helicopters. And so he held that sale informally until the Department of State agreed to incorporate stronger civilian harm mitigation measures. So that shows that there can be a little bit of influence used in this informal process. The problem, though, is because of the dominance of defense and corporate interests in United States Congress, the enmeshment of the United States with other defense security apparatuses, such as that of Israel, and often a deference from Congress to the executive on international affairs. This informal notification often means that by the time there's a formal notification, so Congress announces it, the US government announces the sale is going forward, and Congress in theory has 15 days to vote against the sale. Because all of this has been worked out in back rooms informally, there's often far less resistance to the sale at that point. I will point out, however, that there is currently a joint resolution of disapproval that has been introduced by Bernie Sanders on our various planned transfers to Israel. And so Congress will have an opportunity to vote to block some of those sales. It's just a complicated process. I'll share a link in the chat that involves all sorts of pulling from the Arms Export Control Act. I'll also note that I am not an attorney and my colleague John is. So if there's anything he would like to add or that I am missing, he should feel free to weigh in.
Which is the point of all our humanizing our stories as journalists, which might be the last question, actually. The time really run with you guys. Probably the last question would be to John. Did human rights reports help limit or reduce arms exports from America to Israel, US to Israel?
This is a very important question. And so for the big picture a little bit, the United States provides far more weapons to Israel than any other country in the world. And thus far, the Biden administration has held one restriction on US arms transfers to Israel, and that is a restriction on the transfer of 2,000-pound bombs. The rationale that President Biden supplied for this restriction is that explosive weapons, when used in populated areas, are especially harmful to civilians. And this restriction does hold now, and it was based on reporting on the impact and use of 2,000-pound bombs that we saw in December. The reports that I'm most familiar with were from CNN and the New York Times, but it's not nearly sufficient. It's not nearly sufficient even in light of the rationale that was supplied. Because we've seen that the government of Israel has used not only 2,000-pound bombs, but also smaller weapons, such as GBU-39s or small diameter bombs, and also 1,500-pound bombs equipped with joint direct attack munitions, which guide bombs that are air to ground to their targets. Ari mentioned the very important 6 joint resolutions of disapproval that we're expecting votes on some of which we're expecting votes on in the Senate, 2 of those joint resolutions of disapproval would seek to block certain exports of these joint direct attack munitions. And so the short answer is, yes, reporting has contributed to very limited and insufficient restrictions. But more importantly, it's contributed to an absolute sea change in U.S. public opinion and U.S. citizens' awareness of how weapons bought on their dime and used by U.S. partners are killing civilians, whether in Gaza or now in Lebanon. And so that's very important. And getting this information is also important to continuing to make progress on this front and to moving in the right direction. So that is a discouraging answer, but my underlying message is to keep at it because things can change very quickly, and having reliable information is critical as Congress, which is, I think, probably the more likely avenue for change, is making their decisions.
So actually, this gives me a little bit of more time for a lastest question to Iain, which is a habit that I keep, about adding more to what John has just said about who in the United States can make a difference once they know this info.
Can you say that one more time? Sorry.
John pointed out that the Congress can actually take this leap, but our colleagues are asking who in the United States can also make a difference once this information gets to them.
Well, I mean, you know, I kind of sit between this world of being an academic of sorts, a journalist, and also I speak regularly at the United Nations and I lobby at the UN, and I think that they're you know, one of the tasks increasingly of investigative journalism is shifting into campaigning journalism, where you know, create a premise of something, you keep on at it, you keep on exposing the minutiae, the background hustle, the profiteering, the distance between political claim and political reality. And I think journalistically, it sort of really just boils down to trying to ensure that your editors give you the oxygen of publicity as well as the opportunity to investigate these things, and then, you know, working with NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or, you know, Action on Armed Violence, that we have to a degree the opportunity to investigate these things that I think larger media outlets had maybe 15 years ago. You know, Amnesty has hundreds and hundreds of researchers that maybe, you know, the Guardian doesn't have anymore. So I think it's often about collaborations with media outlets, trying to work with NGOs, making sure that you know, got a good contact list of people out there who are experts in this area. And on that, there is a forum for the arms trade, which I don't know if you know about as journalists. It's run out of Canada. It has over 100 experts on arms trade. I'm pretty sure John's a member. Maybe are you, John? Are you member of the forum?
Yes.
You are. Yep. And I'm not sure if you are, Ari. I can't remember having you are. I thought so. So, you know, it's a really good go-to for people with expertise and specialisms. And I just really recommend the collaborations, doing deep dives, and ultimately arguing with your editors that this is something that needs to be investigated, because, you know, if you follow the money, you'll find just how much profits are being made, and therein lies the ultimate question of who's profiting from, you know, the mountain of dead that we're witnessing in the Middle East at the moment.
I can actually recommend that more. We have more good news. We have 15 minutes more. I don't know how I missed that, but anyhow, if you have the appetite for more questions, please send us more. There is a question from Thomas, and I'll go with it to Ari again. Thomas is asking, do you know anything about the F-35 Joint Project Office and how it maintains and distributed by the partner countries to the US?
Yeah, so the short answer is we don't know a ton about this because it's still an emerging program. But basically the F-35 is a massively expensive United States highly advanced warplane that has been sold to a variety of countries. And in an effort to increase interoperability and transfers, there are a number of countries, including Israel, including several NATO states, that have been selected to be allowed to hold certain F-35 technology kind of in reserve so that they can conduct their own repairs and do their own work rather than waiting on repeated US resupplies. So that is the big top level answer to that. I am not doing any close level tracking of the F-35 program right now, but I'm always happy to help out with polls on information about the technology that is used to facilitate that. But I am not an expert in that particular acquisition program at the moment.
There is actually a question that covers a bit of that, and I'll go with it to John again. It's about the military aid to Egypt from the US and how it's being managed, John.
Sure. So I'll start at the high level. The United States provides over $1 billion every year in foreign military financing to Egypt. Ari told you in her initial presentation the difference between foreign military financing, the money, and foreign military sales, the buying of weapons, in this case, using US money. And so in Egypt, when it comes to Egypt, Congress for several years now has conditioned a portion of the foreign military financing that it provides on certain human rights conditions, on making progress on specific human rights issues in Egypt. If I remember correctly, the political prisoners is especially emphasized in the congressional language. This is happening through the appropriations process, which is the process by which the United States allocates money for different purposes. The United States also does sell weapons to Egypt. And so the most recent one was just last week, potentially the week before, sale of Stinger missiles. And so there are significant human rights concerns when it comes to the conduct of the Egyptian government. And for that reason, Congress has put this condition in place. Unfortunately, the Biden administration recently found that the Egyptian government had made sufficient progress when it came to its human rights record, and therefore released the portion of funds, a couple $100 million to Egypt for the fulfillment of those conditions. Now, it's up to Congress to come back and tell the Biden administration that that is an incorrect assessment. And that's a little bit about the US-Egypt arms relationship. But there is certainly plenty more, and I'm also happy to refer folks to other experts who track this very, very closely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. If you share those resources, we'll be very grateful, which is, and this leads us to a question, is it the practice with Israel, what you just described with Egypt? Iain, the question is coming from Faraz, and Faraz is our interpreter, so we have to take his questions, or else you're going to be just having an English session. So given that Germany, Britain, and the United States have recently stopped granting arms tools, sales licenses to Israel, are these, is there any open source about this topic for journalists or investigative journalists to follow?
I mean, strangely, there's not that many centralized databases. No, at OAV, we did do a snapshot of who is arming Israel. That was around 2-3 months ago now. And of course, that gets out of date. There's the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, CAT, which has pretty good data on its website, which I'd recommend looking at. And as I said, CIPRI will give you the ultimate updates when that information comes out. The one thing you should be, there's two issues there to be well aware of. One is that there may be big statements over, we are not supplying, we're not authorizing these arms exports. But the question you've got to ask is, what do you mean by arms exports? What are you actually authorizing in that? What does it entail? It's only 10% in the UK. And so what is being withheld and what is being permitted is not exactly clear, number one. Number two, there's the grey export market. So it could be that arms go to one location and then from there are re-exported. And that is very poorly understood about how much Israel gets from grey exports. And then there's a third element, which I don't think any journalists have really alighted on, which is this. To what degree is America or Britain buying weapon systems from Israel? So, for instance, the UK government has just bought a whole consignment of AI-driven weapon sites from Israel called Sharpshooter. And this enables you to target more effectively. And I have the question, well, to what degree was that Sharpshooter system deployed as a kind of research and development in Palestine, and how many civilians may have, been killed in the development of this weapon system? And we don't really know. So I think that there's a kind of, it's a two-way engagement. And the final point I'd like to make is this, is that there is a lot has been written about at what point will Ukraine run out of weapons. The same articulation isn't being made about Israel. At what point will they run out of bombs? So there needs to be deeper questions as to how big are their arsenals, where are they getting their routine supplies from, and what journalistically can be done to challenge that routine supply if your editorial line is that IHL violations have occurred and the Israel stands without that. One final point is, although the United States is not a ratified member of the Arms Trade Treaty, the UK is, as is Germany. And so there's the Arms Trade Treaty, of which we are ratified signatories, and we are exporting still to Israel. And so journalists can be looking at the international obligations by those member states who have signed up. Furthermore, the United States, Britain, France, Germany are all signatories of the political declaration not to use explosive weapons in populated areas. And that, whilst that's not going to deal with arms exports, it can be used back to the governments in charge, saying, just a second, you signed up a political declaration not to refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and yet you're authorizing arms exports to Israel, who absolutely is not abiding by any form of restraint when it comes to such use. So there are lots of ways to sort of challenge states and their exports. I probably didn't answer the question entirely correctly. I deviated a bit.
No, that's absolutely perfect. That's perfect. I just wanted to add a little bit on your perfect answer for our colleagues who are joining or trying to compare the other countries in the region, in the Middle East, and their exports from the US compared to what Israel gets. It's the difference between offensive and defensive arms as well. This is something to look at in your stories, our colleagues. There is a question that's an excellent question, actually, from Sam, and I'll go back with it to Ari. The question, have any of the guests, but I decided that Ari will answer that, worked on the arms UAE supplies, the RSF in Sudan, and their Red Crescent humanitarian supplies airplanes?
Thank you. It's a good question. And I'm texting a Sudanese colleague right now who I know has done a really good report on this that I'd love to be able to share. So essentially, yes, there is strong research from the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab and others that the United Arab Emirates is arming the rapid support forces in Sudan and contributing to the catastrophic humanitarian situation around al-Fasher. We know this. We also know that the United Arab Emirates has been shielded from accountability in part because of its closeness to the United States. And I want to talk about an issue that comes up here when we're tracking arms. So the United States sells a lot of arms to the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is also an arms producer in and of itself, and it also can acquire arms from other pipelines. So one of the problems that we see is the United States sells arms to the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates sources guns or other forms of defense equipment from other places. So it's not using the tracked American equipment and sends it violating the arms embargo, whether to Sudan, to Egypt, to other areas. Then the United States says, well, those aren't our weapons. So this isn't something that we can do anything about. So this is one of the big sort of pushes that I think we're trying to make right now, is to separate the arm from the harm, which I think also gets back to this issue of offensive and defensive weapons. From my perspective, there is no such thing as a defensive weapon. A weapon is a weapon. And so I think we've seen this sort of false dichotomy introduced in US legislature to try to justify the continued provision of political and military support to Israel and other countries engaged in severe violations of international law. And the argument that I would make is it does not matter if that is funding for the Iron Dome or if it is funding for guided bomb units to be used in Beirut. The point is this is continued political and military support in violation of US law, even if the specific weapons that are going to be sent will not be used to facilitate a given crime. So for example, I think the United States should be cutting off security assistance to the United Arab Emirates until the United Arab Emirates is in compliance with the arms embargo in Sudan, even if the weapons that it's sending are sourced from other places. So that's one of the big issues we have currently. I'm happy to talk more about that, but that very narrow focus on offensive and defensive weapons, and if this exact gun was used to murder a civilian in an exact violation of law, and if it's the United States, to me, this is all interesting. As journalists, it's important to track and report this, but it is less important than the overall signal of overall political support, not the specific munitions that are being sent.
Perfect. And if you'd like, also my colleagues in the question and answer box, if you'd like to compare, for example, the F-35 that goes to Israel compared to the F-35 that goes to Emirates, this is an interesting story for you to work on because there is a difference. And that was actually a space for conflict in opinions between the UAE and the US. Last question to John is from Clayton again. US arms are required to be shipped via US flagged ships. The exception of that being waivers from the Secretary of Defense. Are these waivers public? And if so, where may I be able to find them?
Good question, and I can give a bit of an indirect answer. But Clayton, I'm happy to connect and see if I can find the statute in question, which is what I would need to give a more definitive answer. So there are a lot of waivers in US law. It's a fairly standard practice. Sometimes, unfortunately, there are waivers in US law that create exemptions from certain legal requirements. Whether those waivers have to be public depends on the specific language in the statute. And so there are certain laws, for example, that require upon the use of a waiver for countries to, or for the executive branch to publish that they have used that waiver or to send a notification to Congress informing them that they have used that waiver. And there are a lot of these also in US arms transfer law. And because I'm not familiar with this specific statute in question here, I can't give an informed answer, but the answer would lie in the structure of the statute. Sometimes these sorts of waivers might be known by congressional committee staff. And so, for example, the House Foreign Affairs Committee might get a notification that a waiver has been used, but the public might not have broader access to it. Sometimes it can also be listed in the Federal Register, which is where the United States keeps all of its information publicly that is relevant for regulatory decision-making. And so, as I said, I don't have the statute in front of me, and so can't give a comprehensive answer, but that's where to look.
And it's actually within the text. This is what John is trying to imply. Thank you so much for all the experts that we had today. It's a very enjoyable session for everybody. Thank you very, very much for answering the questions. To Ari Tolany, to John Chapelle, and to Iain Overton, thank you so much for the resources, and please share more with us on email. And this is a thank you as well from the Global Investigative Journalism Network, GIJN, and special thanks to Majduleen Hassan. Thank you very, very much for the enjoyable session.